Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Joe Biden says US-China relations are now on the right trail and that Antony Blinken has done a hell of a job. We discuss the US's highest level visit to Beijing in nearly 5 years and its impact on soaring US-China tensions. My guests today are Lai I-chung, president of Taiwan think tank, the Prospect Foundation, Arthur Ding, National Chengchi University Professor Emeritus, and Tony Hu, former U.S. Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. President Lai, Professor Ding, and Tony, a very warm welcome to the show today. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has hailed progress between the world's two great powers following his 11th hour meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Beijing. Both sides agreed the need to stabilize relations. Xi told Blinken that China would not challenge or replace the United States and that Washington should respect Beijing and not harm Chinese interests. In a news conference following the meeting, Blinken said China, however, had not agreed to restore military-to-military dialogue despite recent near misses in the Taiwan Strait and over the South China Sea.
Progress is hard. It takes time, and it's not the product of one visit, one trip, one conversation. My hope and expectation is we will have better communications, better engagement going forward. That's certainly not going to solve every problem between us, far from it. But it is critical to doing what we both agree is necessary, and that is responsibly managing the relationship. It's in the interest of the United States to do that. It's in the interest of China to do that. It's in the interest of the world. And I think we took a positive step in that direction over the last 2 days.
Tony, is it remarkable that the meeting happened at all?
Actually, I don't believe so. When Pompeo visited in 2018, he got to see Xi Jinping and others. So it is overdue. And the Chinese play their games and refuse some of the requests for talks. So it is not remarkable. I mean, I suspect the whole world is happy that the meeting took place and hopefully helped reduce the tension.
Arthur Ding, not remarkable?
Well, I guess back to normal. What I mean normal is that they are both able, both United States and China can talk and can communicate. So I think able to talk and communicate is good. Basically speaking, can stabilize the so-called the so-called tension, and the uncertainty.
President Lai, I mean, is this the start of the thaw that Joe Biden mentioned at G7?
I don't think that's going to be the start of anything. But the meeting itself, that means a lot, especially to the United States for their effort to stabilize the U.S.-China competition. And it is the U.S. policy that they wanted to have the direct communication with Chinese at the highest leadership, so that the Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China this time is not just having a conversation with Qin, his counterpart, and also with Wang, that is highest level of Chinese official managing the foreign relations, but also to have the meeting with Xi Jinping himself. Probably to the United States, this means quite a lot.
What message would it have sent if there wasn't a meeting? I mean, that would be pretty devastating.
Well, for the Blinken to not to have a meeting with Xi Jinping, probably that is not going to be a disaster. But for Blinken not to have a meeting with Qin, for example, that will be considered to be a less of their welcome. Yeah.
Tony, did Blinken do a hell of a job in your view? Actually,
if I have to give it a grade, I would give it a 60. It's a necessary process, but if you look at the result, I suspect there's very little result. However, I believe...
why do you say that?
Well, because we haven't seen anything tangible. And while we see something tangible, Blinken already said they refuse to do military communication. Crisis communication is the key in reducing tension and avoiding unintended consequences from possibly military accidents. So crisis communication is very important, but yet we got nothing out of that one, right? And however, I believe behind closed door, I think Blinken probably told them that the whole world expects China to refrain from using arms against Taiwan, and that countries such as United States and some of the allies are committed to come to Taiwan's assistance if China decides to use arms against Taiwan. This type of things, I suspect, was passed on. Basically, it's like what the U.S. saying is, speak softly and carry a big stick. So on the optics side, certainly United States walked in and requested the meeting. Finally, Chinese agreed, you can come and talk. So optic side, China probably got a more positive return from the visit. But hopefully, from the information side, that Blinken was able to pass on those warnings behind closed doors.
Arthur, the issue of South China Sea, human rights, Xinjiang, Taiwan, of course, as Tony mentioned, these will always be core differences. Do you agree with Tony that, would you score Blinken 60%?
I think resume some kind of a channel communication is good. This is the first point. Second is that the U.S. presents position, I think, very, very, very well, because back to the 1979 when the U.S. and the PRC established a diplomatic relation, so-called peaceful settlement of the Taiwan Strait issue. So in the past couple of years, seems the U.S. perceived the China want to unilaterally change the status quo. For instance, frequent incursion of the Taiwan's ADIZ, flying around the Taiwan's area, so on and so forth. So I think the Secretary Blinken really present his viewpoint clearly to Xi Jinping. And on the other hand, Secretary Blinken also said that they don't want to change so-called regime, CCP regime, so on and so forth. Try to somewhat assure the Beijing.
So you believe that he stayed firm on what the U.S. values are and believes in. President Lai, did both sides get to air their grievances and then defend their positions? Let's tackle what Blinken called disabusing the Chinese side of their misunderstanding. Wang Yi, let's go back to what Wang Yi said. He asked that the US stop hyping up the China threat theory, lift its illegal unilateral sanctions against China, abandon the suppression of China's technological development, and refrain from interfering in China's internal affairs. And now let's listen to a clip of Blinken in reference to the so-called suppression of China's technological development.
What is clearly in our interest is making sure that certain specific technologies that China may be using to, for example, advance its very opaque nuclear weapons program, to build hypersonic missiles, to use technology that may have repressive purposes. It's not in our interest to provide that technology to China. And I also made that very clear. So the actions that we're taking, that we've already taken, and as necessary that we'll continue to take, are narrowly focused, carefully tailored to advance and protect our national security.
President Lai, so Professor Ding that mentioned, that he thought that the U.S. was quite firm in its position, didn't sort of make concessions. There we saw, Secretary of State Blinken say that he tried to explain, this so-called the technological suppression of China.
When the Blinken said in public, I think the important differences is that he was able to speak directly to the Xi Jinping himself. And I think that's the whole purpose of the U.S. wanting to engage with China, because in the past, especially during the Biden administration earlier on, they believed that the Chinese Foreign Ministry is not the right vehicle to relay the message in a concrete and also in unabridged term from the United States. And that's why the President Biden continued to seek for a direct engagement with the Xi Jinping, whether from the video conferences or even the personal meetings. And this time, the Blinken, his visit to China and meeting with Xi Jinping, and by saying those words directly in front of him, probably to the United States that this is the whole purpose, because they need to have a direct conversation with Xi Jinping and see what his response is. So rather than it's not just about I'm going to tell you the important message, but also I would like to know that what will be your reactions, your body language by hearing those. And we also like to know that after hearing our explanations, what will be your response? I think it is those intangibles right there that the U.S. is actually looking for and in those visits.
And what do we know about what was actually discussed in the Xi meeting?
We do not know actually, because if you look at the
35 minutes.
First of all, Taiwan will be briefed by the United States later on. So our diplomats in D.C., they will have a bigger picture and a fuller picture than all of us here. And second, will this lead to the other engagement from the U.S. and then China? One thing we will look at is that will the Xi Jinping actually reciprocate by going to the San Francisco this November for the APEC meeting? That's one thing people will look at. Another thing will be that right now the U.S. China, they have already engagement in economic sphere, in diplomatic sphere, although the military still remain silenced. But will those engagements lead to other discussions as well as a cooperation that the United States or China is looking for? So those are another the area that people will look at.
Professor Ding, so Qin Gang was invited to go to Washington and he agreed, so that is a good step forward. Let's talk about the optics, some of the sort of diplomatic signals that China created during the trip. There were a few. People have been talking about the seating arrangement of Xi at the head of a table. There's also the fact that the meeting itself wasn't confirmed for much of the 2-day visit. It was left right to the end. Blinken wasn't greeted at the airport by a top official. There was no red carpet, only a red line. You know.
Well, I guess for the meeting between Blinken and Xi Jinping, I guess probably Beijing tried to send a picture that kind of we call the ancient tributary system, you know.
Right.
But you know, if we look at back to a couple of years ago when President Trump was in office, you know, President Trump also, you know, sitting in the White House, and the Chinese delegation leader, Vice Premier Liu He, you know, sitting around the audience, you know, listen to President Trump's remarks. So I guess, you know, this is kind of a
so paying tribute. The U.S. comes to pay tribute to Xi Jinping.
So maybe, you know, this is the arrangement deliberately made by Xi Jinping. Say, okay, now U.S. pay a tribute to me, you know, and to so-called great, you know, the Chinese Communist Party, you know, how great our nation, so on and so forth. I guess he tried to, you know, convey this kind of a message to domestic audience, I would say. You know.
Okay, Tony, do you want to pick up on some of those measures?
Absolutely, it's mostly for domestic audience because Xi Jinping continued to project the image of China becoming greater than United States. Obviously, he said that, you know, China doesn't want to replace the United States, but he said many things before that's not true. So I suspect this is one of those. He certainly does want to, during his term, he wants to have China replace the United States as one of the world leaders, if not the world leader. So this is just one of the things to show the Chinese people, I came into power, and now the Americans are begging over to see me. I initially refused. I won't talk to them. I won't answer the phone. Now I allow them to come. So he wants to project that image that shows his greatness.
President Lai, what do you think was intended by the red line? You know, and we saw in the footage that Blinken did cross that line coming off the plane.
Whether or not China intended for that, I think the body language of Blinken that crossing that red line sort of indicate that well, you had your red line, but I had my own actions. So that's how the people will read whether the Blinken himself intentionally want to do that, but the result is already has been put forward to the international audience. But of course, we do know that the whole sitting arrangement and as presented in camera, they definitely show the hierarchy. That Xi Jinping is the one that he's the boss of everything, and they are the U.S. official and Chinese official all sitting on both ends and listen to what Xi Jinping wanted to say. So Xi Jinping is the director of everything, and the rest of them, you are just the technocrats. You negotiate between yourself, and I'm going to give you the overall framework and how this meeting should be.
Professor Ding, I mean, you've probably observed several of these visits by foreign dignitaries to Beijing. In general, how do you think he was received? Was it, would you call it warm, courteous, or cold? My
interpretation is that Xi Jinping tried to some extent, try to correct his the so-called wrong policy made by previous decades. Because we all know that he alienated all the traditional Western countries, right? From the look at the relationship between Western countries in Europe and China. The CAI Comprehensive Agreement for Investment has been frozen by the EU Parliament, right? So I guess the Xi Jinping, he knows that, and also along with so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. I would say this is China try to somewhat correct his previous wrong policy. I guess. Yeah.
So you believed it was actually quite a warm reception for Blinken to correct the previous. Sorry, is that what your meaning was?
Well, for the Blinken one, my own guess is Xi Jinping also want to show a moderate face, I guess, to the United States. I would say, because we all know that in the U.S. this so-called anti-China become the most so-called strong consensus among the different sectors, right? So I think the Xi Jinping also knows that he have to somewhat change his image because time is limited. Because before the end of this year, this is the only window of opportunity. Because beginning next year will be election in the United States, and China definitely will be an issue. So before the election next year, then he tried to portray a kind of a moderate image to the United States. He's a kind of a partner able to negotiate.
So perhaps neither too cold nor too warm. To offer more insights about Blinken's visit, my next guest is James Crabtree, Executive Director of London-headquartered think tank International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia. James is based in Singapore. I spoke to him on Monday ahead of Xi Jinping's meeting. Let's take a look. Things that Blinken said going into this visit was that he wanted to reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation. What are those misperceptions?
I think that the thing the Americans want above all is to have open channels of communication. So if anything goes wrong, they can talk to each other and fix it. The challenge is that the Chinese don't particularly want that. They feel that if they do grant these open channels of communication, then that creates a weird incentive in which the Americans can take greater risks, safe in the knowledge that they can use these channels of communications to work things out later. So far, there's been no sign that the end state that the Americans want, namely a heavily competitive relationship, but one that has a lot of fallback and safety mechanisms, is one that China is very likely to agree to. And that remains a huge structural problem.
The critics of the Biden administration, talk about perhaps the concessions that the Biden administration has made. For example, in the balloon, so withholding the final results of that investigation.
So I think there have been some steps that the US have taken in order to try and lower the temperature. And yes, people have pointed to the fact that in the aftermath of the balloon incident, there hasn't been an FBI publication or any parading of the bits of the balloon as perhaps one might have expected. Nonetheless, the fact that it's Blinken who went to Beijing, as I say, this is the kind of normal course of diplomacy, as in the last time that the Chinese foreign minister met with the US Secretary of State. It was on American soil in Alaska, and it's just been an awfully long time since they've met, but it was the turn of the US to go to Beijing this time. So, I mean, I think the bigger challenge is, can they restart some of the communication mechanisms that have been stalled? So in the aftermath of former US House Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taipei last year, China canceled a whole bunch of mechanisms, particularly on the military-to-military side. So for instance, the ability of the US Indo-PACOM commander in Hawaii to speak to the commander of the PLA Southern Theater Command. I think that is a real test to see whether this moment after the meeting will actually bear fruit, or whether it simply means that, you know, that they've had a civil meeting, but not very much is going to change.
So you were speaking to us from Singapore. Can you tell us what the feeling there is in terms of Blinken's visit and also US-China rivalry?
In Southeast Asia, in addition to welcoming the fact that Blinken went, and it seems to have gone, you know, reasonably well relative to expectations, people will be looking to see, you know, are there any glimmers of hope that a marginally more cooperative relationship may be possible. But I think we have to be realistic here. There are still a lot of new competitive measures coming down the tracks. The US is going to target outbound investment on China. It's going to almost certainly ban TikTok in the United States. There'll be new measures targeting Huawei. And China will do similar things as it did targeting Micron, the US memory chip maker. So I think that you have to be realistic about the prospects for some kind of wider rapprochement, because both sides are going to continue competing with one another, and that creates this tit-for-tat cycle, which is very hard to break out of.
And so in Singapore, is it seen as tit for tat, or do commentators, you know, say that the US is provoking China, or that China is being irresponsible in holding back dialogue?
I think in general it's seen as both of them are at fault to some degree. I mean, I think that goes back and forth depending on the circumstances. I think in the aftermath of the Pelosi visit, there was a danger for the US that it was beginning to be seen to be the more destabilizing of the two parties. However, the US, I think, has learned some lessons from that, and it has tightened up its communication in the aftermath of that. And so I think typically when people in Singapore and Southeast Asia view these challenges, or rather view the relationship, they call for de-escalation on both sides.
James, are you largely optimistic or pessimistic that the US and China can stop a downward spiral in their relations?
I would say I'm realistic that it has been getting worse over the last few years, and I think there are heavy downward pressures that will see it at least not improve very much over the coming few years. That said, this year in particular does offer some prospects. There are two potential meetings between President Biden and President Xi in the second half of this year, the first at the G20 in India and the second at the APEC summit in the United States in November. What you tend to see happen is that when President Xi and President Biden meet, they make things better rather than worse. So I think it is possible, despite all of the problems in the bilateral relationship, that at the end of this year, relations between the PRC and the United States might be a little bit better, or certainly no worse than they are at the moment.
That was James Crabtree of International Institute for Strategic Studies speaking with me earlier. Professor Ding, let me come to you first. Let's discuss one of the points that James makes. He was talking about, that Beijing feels that if it granted open channels of communication to the US, then this would somehow enable the Americans to take greater risks, safe in the knowledge that they can then fall back on these, the lines of communication. Do you agree with this view?
Yeah, I kind of agree, because Beijing taking this kind of opportunity as kind of favor, given to the United States. On the one hand, as we said earlier, to show how great China is, and all the major Western countries have tried to seeking some help, assistance from China. So I guess that's why Beijing has been kind of to try to show image, they are the U.S. demand China more than the China need the United States.
Right.
So that's why I'm kind of agree with Crabtree's assessment. Yeah.
Right. Tony, you know, is it a form of brinkmanship? Sort of limit the access and then give it out bit by bit as a form of, you know, reward, or you know, pull it back if it's punishment?
Actually, I think structurally, China is not going to allow crisis management response at a lower level because, as Professor Lai mentioned earlier, China is a one-man show. Xi Jinping is in charge. So when something happens, nobody dares to answer the phone and respond without Xi Jinping said, this is how we're going to react. I think, I mean, I've been doing this for many years, as both of you have, and the U.S. will have many crises that we want to get on the hotline and get with China, and they never answer when we have a crisis.
So it's not just at the current situation?
No. So I believe it's not because they want to, but they were told not to, but because they don't dare to. The people who's next to the phone, even the Minister of Defense himself, I think they're too scared to respond without Xi Jinping first know about it and decide how we're going to respond. So structurally, the communist single leader structure prevents crisis communication at a lower level. That's what I think, just based on my past experience.
There was the October surprise, though, in 2020, when General Mark Milley picked up the phone.
We called them because we had a crisis. It's not because, like, when the balloon, we shut down the balloon, or when the airplane crossed over and we wanted to say, hey, that's dangerous, they don't answer. But when we call, they want to know what it's about because they haven't done anything wrong at that point. So they answered and set up the call. So that's different. That's U.S. crisis. But when there is a crisis caused by China, they never answer, not that in my memories.
Right. President Lai, so what Blinken, is your position that Blinken did achieve something in managing to get the meeting with Xi Jinping, who we said is, you know, he's essentially the only guy there in China making the decisions. So this is a form of progress, of achievement.
If you compare with what was in the past, like in year 2021, that in March, then we have a shouting match between the Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi in Alaska. And then due to the COVID, and we have a freeze of the communications. And like Wendy Sherman, when the Deputy Secretary of State, when she went to China, she cannot even meet the number 2 guy. And she was downgraded to meet the number 7 guy in the foreign ministries. So in terms of the meeting levels, this time the Blinken not only meet with the Qin Gang and also Wang Yi, and then to the Xi Jinping. I think for the United States, this is much of a progress. And the issue when we talk about the, especially like military communications, I think in addition to what Tony said, that the China is a top-down system, so that the bottom-up process probably will not work in China. Is not accustomed to do that, and the lower-level officials, since they are not empowered, they dare to answer or pick up the phone. But there is also the belief that in Chinese system that the confidence building, which means that we first have to agree on principles. So we need to have a political consensus, and then everything will follow from that. But in the United States, the issue about a confidence building measure is precisely we have no confidence, so we need to build on that in order to increase the confidence. But for China, it is on the other way around. We need to have a confidence first, and then we could do other things. And then that result to like Chinese always take the confidence building measure or those hotline as a first line to disconnect in order to show the Chinese displeasure toward the other side. And the United States, that's precisely the point that you cannot cut it off, because probably the top leaders, they cannot talk to each other, but the lower level official, they need to communicate to maintain a functional exchange.
Right, yeah. So it's a little bit like what Lloyd Austin said at Shangri-La Dialogue, where he said that dialogue is a necessity, it's not a reward.
Yeah, and Li Shangfu apparently doesn't see it that way.
But all this as pressure increases from US Congress for the Biden administration to take a tougher stance on China. Now, Republicans have criticized the administration for what they call being soft on China. This is not a new thing. In his Wall Street Journal op-ed, US-China House Committee Chair Mike Gallagher calls the US's current diplomacy with China a return to the engagement of 20, 30 years ago, when the West initially embraced China, believing that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. And he's coined it zombie engagement. Gallagher says it places the burden of improving relations on the US rather than demanding that Beijing adjust its malign behavior. We give up the farm simply to get to the negotiating table. How do you view this criticism?
I guess many analysts know that in the late period of President Obama era, there has been a lot of complaint from the Washington D.C. area, because the complaint is that the China has not commit China has not honored the commitment made in year 2000 when China entered the WTO. So this is the basic point. But President, we do hear lots of complaint, but President Biden, just in order to maintain the relationship, so he didn't make a strong reaction. But President Trump come to office and he made a strong reaction. So since 6 years has passed since President Trump come to the office, but do we see any kind of progress made by China in order to address those complaints by the United States? Actually not. Beijing does not make anything. Instead, the thing gets worse. So that is the. So if we want to, but Beijing point all the finger to the United States. All you're wrong. We make no wrong. So we can see, there's such a huge difference between of perception over this kind of relationship. So to some extent, Congressman Gallagher's comment, I would say is correct, because China taking this kind of U.S. need China more than China need the U.S. more than So I guess this is the China has to take some blame for the deteriorated relationship here, because China have never honored its commitment here. So that's why a lot of complaint and criticism from the Congressman Gallagher.
Tony.
Yeah, excellent remarks by Arthur. The fact is, through my days in Department of Defense, we were doing engagement for the sake of engagement. We get no tangible result, and every time, because with other countries we have objectives we want to achieve, and when we send teams to China, when China come visit, we walk away with, what did we accomplish? Nothing. Then we want to engage to reduce threat. Look at the threat now. All these years of engagement, especially on defense, I'm talking about on the defense side. So now.
So this is an indictment then of U.S. policy, is what you're saying?
It is. And unfortunately, the comment about zombie engagement, I sort of agreed, because we get into that mode. Let's just be friends. Just go visit. Visit ought to have a purpose. So if we don't get a threat reduction from this visit, let's look at what's going on. If the threat continues, then we need to do engagement for deterrence. You need to get in a different mode. You go from engagement to reduce threat to engagement to deter. If deterrence failed, then when we engage, we're going to defeat them. We're going to tell them we're going to kick your butt. So there ought to be some kind of guidelines and achievables. And if they're not willing to do that stuff, as Arthur said, we often walk away with nothing. Then why are we doing it, right? And
the situation is just getting worse
and worse. Just get worse.
Yeah. President Lai, Ryan Hass responded in a tweet to the Gallagher's article, saying, Gallagher wants to argue China policy on a tough versus weak axis, where strength and hard power determine winning versus losing. He's the one applying outdated framework to the debate, not the Biden administration. What's your view on this central debate?
Well, I think Wang has sort of wanted to frame this discussion in terms of soft and hard, and the Mike Gallagher attacking the Biden administration as soft, and then he would like to argue otherwise, and believe that this is an outdated framework. But I think the issue, Mike Gallagher, although in an Opaque in an article talks about the issue about being soft or not, but the essence is basically why do we do the engagement for the engagement's sake? Just like the previous two speakers, they talk about, and the whole thing, if you look at the Biden administration, is that they wanted to have a responsible management about the relationship, but it seems that the U.S. is the one that's trying to be responsible, and while China is still behaving just like the troublesome teenage boys, and China has never been asked or been lead to that what are the things that they need to do in order to improve the relationship, or what.
So that was never made clear to them. Is that what you're saying?
I will say that the process that the United States wanted to have the conversation and the communication with China, and U.S. started to drop all kind of criticism or the requirement on Chinese end.
So it is like
China, just for example, about the balloon incident and Chinese military harassment, not just about Taiwan, but also to Japan and other places. Those are the issue that go unaddressed or have been compartmentalized, just for the sake of the having this engagement to be able to take place. I'm not saying that the engagement itself is not important. Of course, the United States has, as a manager, tried to find a way to manage these competitions. But it is important also to know that sometimes if the other side does not want to have the engagement, what could you do? What would be the best possible thing that you wanted to go instead of trying to ask for the engagement? I think this is something that the United States, as well as other countries, they could think harder on this.
Tony, so building on what President Lai said, I mean, you previously, earlier in our discussion, talked about speaking softly with a big stick. So is your view that that approach doesn't work with China, or that the U.S. is not doing that?
I think that approach is what works with China, because China recognizes hard power. They take soft power approach as weakness. You're scared of me, so you are coming to me in this manner. So hopefully United States have learned through the past experience and start talking the language that China understands.
But just recently, Biden, I mean, let's say to enable this meeting, talked about the silly balloon incident, said that the balloon incident was probably something that the top leadership, I assume he's talking about Xi Jinping, wasn't aware of. This is very recent.
I think, once again, try to save face for China to allow this to happen, but behind closed door, I fully expect the United States play the hardball that it needs to. I believe this administration had learned the lessons from previous administrations, where being kind and being nice doesn't get you anywhere with China. So I suspect this message was passed, and those talking points that's written by the staff, I suspect will be very harsh and straightforward. No more sugarcoating, to make sure China understands that this type of dangerous behavior, intercepts, it's not acceptable. It could cause accidents. We will see if this approach worked, if this type of activity continues on in the future freedom of navigation operations.
Okay. Now, The Economist reports that China is headed for a double-dip recession, despite what many expected would be a COVID rebound in China. The world's second biggest economy is not expected to grow in the second quarter this year compared to the first quarter. Official statistics show youth employment also rose above 20%, the highest since records began in 2018. And figures for retail sales, investment and property sales all fell short. China's new open for business mantra, stable foreign trade, stable foreign investment, acknowledges the need for improving China's ties to fuel its faltering economy. This is one of the reasons Chinese officials met with US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and US Trade Representative Catherine Tai in the US last month. This despite giving defense and political officials the cold shoulder. Professor Ding, are the headwinds facing the Chinese economy a key reason why Beijing is open to this further engagement now?
That is part of the reason, because when you both the United States and China compete each other, each country have to make assessment of so-called national power. In the previous decade, we see China has been overestimated their own capability and the so-called the rise of East and the decline of West. And so, and the China will overtake the United States. In the previous decade, we heard so many this kind of a voice, but in the past couple of years, when President Trump and President Biden launched the so-called technological sanction, then China started to realize, their weakness, so on and so forth. So this is the first point, And after the COVID, they start to find, in addition to the so-called aging society, there's no people that are not consume. There's no so-called consumption economy as they expected. This is the first point. Second is, as I said, the strained relationship between China and the traditional Western countries. So my own guess is that overall, Xi Jinping and his top aide, made the internal assessment to see how should they respond, this kind of the overall problem. So that's why, as I said earlier, they invited so many top leaders from Western countries, and they invite the top entrepreneur, those businessmen, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, so on and so forth, to visit China and hope that they can bring, the investment.
Tony, I did put it to James Crabtree whether the Xi Jinping and Bill Gates meeting was actually set up as a contrast to, Blinken's visit. What do you believe? Was that what was the message that was sent? We saw a very different setup. I mean, the two men sitting together at the front of the room. What's your view?
Yeah, I think certainly there's an element of trying to make Blinken look a little bit less than Bill Gates. However, I think it is an image, once again, more for a domestic consumption. We're trying to reassure the Chinese people that Western businesses still trust in the China market and still wants to invest in China market, try to build some more confidence within its own people about the strength of China's economy, because people can see that Chinese no longer can sustain itself without some kind of international business investment, because there's so many foreign plants there, and all these millions of people are employed by these foreign companies. So they know this, and I think Xi Jinping wants to reassure the Chinese people that the Western businesses are still here, still coming here, still want to invest here, to reassure his own people.
President Lai, I mean, we talked about the business leaders, the foreign business, Western business leaders, but also China is keen to have the visit by Janet Yellen, the Secretary Treasury, as well as Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, and also John Kerry. What's your feeling? Does Washington need to push harder on the military-to-military dialogue? Should it be that they need to open that, or at least say that they commit to the military dialogue before allowing people like Janet Yellen to go to China?
I would look at it this way. First of all, the Chinese would permit Janet Yellen and Catherine Tai and have a direct economic conversation with their counterpart in China. And also the Xi Jinping person meet with Bill Gates as well as the Elon Musk for those conversations. That means that the Chinese right now really look at the economy as the critical issue that they want to bring up and trying to manage. And so that reflect the kind of the domestic economic conditions that they're facing, and also Xi Jinping recognizes the issues that especially right now, foreign direct investments actually went to the lowest level since year 2000, and also the issue about the how the Western investment in China. The lack of confidence is precisely due to the Xi Jinping's political management of the economy. So that Xi Jinping, by meeting with those the business leaders of the West, trying to not just tell about the Chinese that the West is still coming into China, but also trying to reassure the West that your business leaders can continue to go to China because I am going to give them the kind of political cover they needed in doing business in China. Does that mean that we need to link them together so that the military, without the military communication, then you won't be able to meet with our economic ministers? I do not have the clear answer about this because sometimes the compartmentalization is good, sometimes it's not. But I think we could look at other examples. For the issue about China and India, it is India that insists on we have to. You don't solve the boundary military confrontation, then there is no normalization about India-China relations. But China continued to push for the normalization of it. So it seems that India is in a higher end, and China is begging them for the meeting. Another interesting example is that China definitely tried to woo the European Union to his side in its competition vis-a-vis the United States. So interesting thing happened. Last week, our Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu, physically visited several countries. First, he stopped at the Czech, and even have the meeting, not exactly the meeting, but the picture conversations with the Czech president in the same frame. And then he went on, Joseph Wu went on to Poland and Brussels, and also a surprising and pleasant visit to Italy. But so far, we haven't seen China is complaining or doing anything about Czech, about Poland, about Brussels, about Italy. So what was the differences? Why the China the protesting against the United States every time they have, but this time that the China is not doing the protest or the complaint we expected to have, especially this is already 1 week after the Joseph Wu's visit with the Czech president. So what happened? And I think the difference probably could attribute to China is now wanting to have the EU on its side, so that they are willing to put those differences, compartmentalize the differences. So it is China who would like to do that. So I think it's important to for other countries, including the United States, to look at what are the advantage and the disadvantage China has, so that we can recalculate the issue about the engagement.
Okay, well, we have to end it there. Thank you so much, President Lai, Professor Ding, and Tony, for joining Taiwan Talks today.